The US has struck back against IRGC-backed militant groups across Iraq and Syria following the attacks on Tower 22. We also discuss how Ukraine is hitting a turning point, both with aid and how the war is going. We'll also be talking about an upcoming interview of Vladimir Putin that might be just a psyop. I've also got an update on this channel that's important, especially for those of you that have stuck around this channel for a while, so be sure to stay until the end for that. All of these stories and more in this week's edition of the International Affairs News Roundup. On to the first story. Last week we talked about the strikes against US forces at Tower 22 in Jordan and how we were basically still waiting for the US to respond. Well, basically not even a day went by since I released that video until the US did respond. And it's certainly the most significant response we've seen from the US since this whole conflict began. This response basically consisted of a large series of airstrikes across Iraq and Syria with over 80 targets being hit. The sites that were being targeted were identified as being used by groups that align with the IRGC. A lot of those sites appear to belong to a group called Kyiv Hezbollah. We talked about them a little bit last week, but a lot of people are pointing to them as the group that was responsible for the attack on Tower 22. Some of the targets included command and control nodes, logistics facilities, and other kinds of storage facilities that house drones or rockets and missiles. Before the US response, there had been over 160 attacks on US forces all across the Middle East. And while this response was indeed broad, it appears to only be the beginning, with both Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin and President Biden stating that this is just the beginning of what will be a lengthy and tiered response. And indeed, we've seen that with another strike against the leader of Kyiv Hezbollah in the center of Baghdad. There's a lot to unpack with this response. I mean, the whole response was telegraphed for nearly a week between the attack on Tower 22 and whenever the response actually happened. That's more than enough time for the leadership of Kyiv Hezbollah and other groups to flee back into Iran and for the fighters to basically disperse their supplies to other facilities. It could be that the US wanted to see where their fallback positions were to strike the fallback positions, so then they could also strike the primary positions once they move back to those, but that's just speculation. However, with all of that happening, there's only been nearly a dozen killed from one group in Iraq, at least that's what has been reported, and that does not include any IRGC officials. The response was broad, but we've also seen more attacks against US forces since those strikes happened. In fact, it appears that so far the US response has not succeeded in deterring, IRGC-backed groups from attacking US forces. This not only includes attacks on US forces in Iraq and Syria, but it also includes attacks by the Houthis on the US Navy off the coast of Yemen. Now, we need to take a good and honest look here at this crisis because there's more at play than just this crisis right now. And all of that kind of ties into US decision making and really why we're going to see probably not a dramatic kind of escalation from the US over this issue, at least not until they're forced to do so. With the war in Ukraine being where it is and concerns over China's actions in Taiwan, there's really a lot that the US has to consider right now. There are a lot of global crises that the US has to consider. All of that with the US election coming up, and it's clear that the administration has to walk a tightrope. Strategically, the US has to balance these crises, meaning that they can't get pigeonholed in any one crisis. They have to be prepared to adapt and respond to two or more of these crises. The war in Ukraine has shown just how intense and resource consumptive a high-intensity conflict can be, and the conflict in the Middle East has shown just how unpredictable and surprising these conflicts can be. And while the US has been able to, for the most part, avoid direct involvement with any of these crises, the conflict in the Middle East has certainly drawn the US its closest that it's been to direct involvement. With regard to the election, the administration likely sees that it has to walk a tightrope here. On one hand, you have to respond to the attacks on US soldiers, and you have to respond forcefully and in a way that deters these groups from attacking further. However, that does risk escalation, and if things continue to spiral out of control, then the administration could get blamed for that. However, on the other hand, if the administration does not respond forcefully enough, then that by itself could bring a lot of criticism for the administration. It's a fine line that they have to walk right now, and they're having to walk it in incredibly challenging conditions while also considering multiple crises around the world. But with all that being said, I want to hear your thoughts on this because it is very complex. There are a lot of difficult decisions that need to be made here, and I want to know what you think. From there, we need to talk about the Red Sea. The Houthi strikes in the Red Sea have led to some amount of economic impact, which includes increased transportation costs and rising insurance costs for ships that are traversing the Red Sea. Of course, those of you that have been watching these videos and those of you that have been paying attention to the news, you know that the Houthis have been targeting commercial ships with drones and ballistic missiles. These attacks have led to a major rerouting of international trade from the Suez Canal, which has, at least before the conflict, accounted for 12% of global international trade. The global economy, which is already strained by a cost of living crisis and rising inflation, is going to have to deal with this challenge as well. Ships diverted away from the Suez Canal have to go all the way around the Cape of Good Hope, which leads to rising shipping costs and a drop in shipping efficiency. And this may lead to rising import costs for critical goods, including grains and oil. Brent crude prices have seen an increase of 8% following the attacks, which shows an immediate impact of this diversion. And to hammer home the importance of the Suez Canal, 30% of the world's container shipping traverses the Suez Canal annually. Now, we've already talked about how these attacks have led some of the world's largest shipping companies to actually halt shipping through the Suez Canal and through the Red Sea. And that decision can add more than $1 million in additional costs per trip. That's a lot of money. And this has all left an impact specifically on the Chinese economy, as the bulk of Chinese trade with Europe actually traverses through the Red Sea and is now having to be rerouted through the Cape of Good Hope. And in fact, 90% of EU-China trade traverses this route. In 2022, EU to Chinese trade accounted for over 626 billion euros. That's also a lot of money. Initial estimates for the economic impact on this trade because of the Houthi strikes have estimated up to 135 billion euros being lost because of this disruption. And that not only impacts the European economy, that does impact the Chinese and other economies across Eastern Asia. I bring up China and their economy because this is not really a disruption or a crisis that they can afford to deal with right now. According to one economic analyst, China not only missed its growth forecast for 2023, but it actually retracted. However, official numbers are being reported to show the Chinese economy is still growing. The analyst was measuring different sectors like real estate and imports and exports, as well as household consumption. And I've included a link to this report down in the description. All of this while the Chinese stock market appears to be collapsing. The small cap stock market in China appears to have dropped over 30% since the start of 2024. And I say all of this to say that the Red Sea crisis is not just really America's problem, it's a global problem, and it's also a huge problem for China. And while we shouldn't necessarily overstate the impact to the US economy that this crisis will have, it's certainly making a huge dent in the European and the Chinese economies. Now, the crisis across the Middle East with the US and different IRGC-backed groups, as well as the Red Sea crisis, is all really kind of happening because of one thing, and that's the Israeli-Gaza war. And that takes us to what Israel is doing in Gaza right now. Israel has begun flooding the Hamas tunnels in Gaza to neutralize the tunnels. This involves channeling seawater into the tunnels, and this is a tactic that has been confirmed by the IDF. Now, the implications of this decision are multifaceted. There are legal, there are environmental concerns, and there are humanitarian concerns. Scientists and environmental analysts have all raised concerns over the risk of pumping seawater into the tunnels because it risks impacting Gaza's coastal aquifer, which is already vulnerable due to overpumping and contamination. This could lead to a scarcity of clean water in Gaza, which is a huge problem. Don't forget, at least pre-war, there were 2.3 million residents. Additionally, the seepage of seawater into the ground could lead to issues with the land no longer being arable, in Gaza no longer being able to grow crops and other kinds of agricultural goods. Some have also pointed out that this might be a breach of international humanitarian law, particularly if this causes widespread and lasting damage to the environment, and that impacts civilian life, which it likely will. All that being said, from a military perspective, this is the fastest and most effective way that they're going to be able to handle these tunnels. Yeah, it'll definitely be creating some environmental damage, but those are likely costs that the IDF is willing to take. It's been clear since the beginning of the war that the IDF isn't necessarily concerned of what the outside world thinks. They're just going to do what they're going to do. But there are also strategic risks to flooding the tunnels. Not only is there the risk of potentially trapping or harming the hostages that are held down there, but other hazardous materials like ammunition and fuel might be stored in bulk in the tunnels. And if that mixes with the seawater and that also gets into the ground, then that might cause other problems for agriculture. There's no easy fix for the tunnels, but again, and this is something that we really need to contextualize, when it comes to military decision making, environmental concerns will often take a back seat. Remember, and we haven't really talked about this conflict for a minute, but remember what we've been talking about since the beginning. Israel believes that it's fighting right now a war that is existential to its existence. It's not going to cut corners in the war because of environmental concerns. It's going to do what it needs to do to win. And any other country that is facing the same challenge would do the exact same thing. Now, will this create a situation where Israel might have to fight another war in 15 to 20 years because it created an environmental catastrophe here that Gazans feel is completely unacceptable and they rise up again in response to later? Yeah, that might happen. But you see that the IDF is already trying to handle this situation decidedly handedly right now by destroying the tunnels and by destroying a lot of residential areas along the border zone with Israel to create what they describe as a buffer zone. And we'll see what Israel chooses to do and how they kind of design Gaza after this conflict. But it's clear that they're not going to tolerate another large-scale combat operation like this in the future with Gaza. And they're willing to create a humanitarian catastrophe if it means that Israel is not going to have to fight here anymore. Now, with all of that being said, I want to pivot back over to Russia for a moment. We've talked about the impact of sanctions on the Russian economy and how there have been some limits, but there have been some strikes on Russia that have led to some more research on the impacts of the Russian economy that the war has had. Russia is expected to significantly decrease its exports of oil and gasoline following Ukrainian strikes on refinery plants. And this has been prompted by several Ukrainian strikes in some of Russia's largest refinery plants all across Russia. In fact, up to a third of Russia's naphtha exports could be cut completely. Ukraine has been targeting Russian oil facilities all across the country since the war began with drones and rocket attacks. And the goal has, of course, been to impact the Russian economy where it is strongest, and that is in energy. And I don't think it's necessarily crazy to say that these strikes are going to make a huge impact on the Russian economy. After all, you have sanctions which are preventing the Russian economy from being able to acquire a lot of repair resources easily. It's not that they're not able to acquire those resources, it's just that it takes them a little bit longer and it's going to cost them a little bit more than it did before. However, at the same time, they need to do that quickly because Ukraine has been so successful in its sabotage efforts. Of course, we've talked about the limits of sanctions though in the last video, so if you want to check that out, then definitely do so. Now, you're probably a lot like me and you like to read the news, but you're probably also a lot like me and you're frustrated with how much bias you see in the news. That's why I like to drop into Ground News every now and again and check out different news articles and see exactly where the bias is. Ground News does a great job of giving different scores and values to different articles so you can see what headlines are going to lean left and right and center, and that really gives you an idea on how things are being reported on either side. I say all that to say that I have an affiliate link down in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to support this channel. That really goes a long way. They're not sponsoring this video. I'm just a fan of Ground News and I wanted to give attention to that. So check it out if that sounds interesting to you. We just got an update from Ukraine that we absolutely need to talk about, and that is that Volodymyr Zelensky has officially fired, or at least relieved, his commander-in-chief of the armed forces, Valery Zaluzhny. Now, replacing Zaluzhny is General Alexander Syrsky. Now, for folks that are not familiar with who Syrsky is, he helped organize the Kyiv defense. However, since then, he has actually become pretty unpopular amongst the Ukrainian military. He's earned names like the Butcher, and he's been likened to other people like Gerasimov and Prigozhin because of his penchant for human wave style attacks and just kind of a more Russian theory of war, which is to say, you know, more mass fires and then mass assaults with a lot of bodies and not necessarily a lot of maneuver and movement. He's also been criticized for the defense of Bakhmut, mainly his insistence that Ukraine stay in Bakhmut and not really attempt to withdraw from Bakhmut. And it looks like Avdiivka is becoming one of those locations as well. Now, we're going to talk about the impacts of this probably next week as we kind of continue to monitor this. Already right now, just watching the news breaking, the reviews do not seem great. People do not seem to be fans of this decision. So we are going to watch that and see what happens. Zelensky, you know, we talked last week about why Zelensky would do this. And we've also talked about how this, you know, decision like this is not unprecedented. It happens in war. There are plenty of historical examples and plenty of examples where, you know, the general or, you know, whenever a general was dismissed in the middle of a war, where that side still won. So this doesn't mean that it's all done. There's still a lot ahead of Ukraine right now. However, politically, Zelensky is putting himself in a pretty interesting position by removing a general who is certainly popular within the Ukrainian military and replacing him with someone who's very unpopular with the military. And not only that, a general who has a track record for really costing the Ukrainian military a lot of lives. We'll talk about this next week more in depth if we get some more information on this. It'll be interesting to see where Zaluzhny goes. And it'll be interesting to see kind of the wider reaction within the Ukrainian military and kind of monitor that. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments on this. A lot to discuss. Now, there have been a lot of issues in Ukraine and Israel that we've already talked right now. And backing both Israel and Ukraine in these conflicts has been the United States with financial and military aid. However, a lot of that does rely on Congress. and needless to say, Congress has issues. I'm sure no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, we can all agree Congress has issues. And now, unfortunately, those issues are starting to impact U.S. aid for Ukraine and Israel. Now, the gridlock, of course, stems from disagreements on a package deal that would include funding for Israel, funding for Ukraine, and funding for border protection. However, there are deep divisions over the allocations of these funds. For instance, some want a deal that only funds Israel and the border. Some want a deal that funds Ukraine as well. The Senate unveiled a $118 billion package deal that funds both Ukraine and Israel and includes other provisions. However, House Speaker Mike Johnson declared that that package would be dead on arrival once it reached the House. And of course, President Biden stated that any deal that does not include aid for Ukraine would be vetoed. So it appears that the House is really the weak link in this whole chain of aid. That aid package that the Senate proposed would include $60 billion in aid for Ukraine, $14.1 billion in aid for Israel, and additional funding for U.S. partners trying to combat Chinese aggression. It also includes significant changes to U.S. immigration policy. Now, this whole saga has actually seen the aid for Ukraine becoming more partisan. What was once bipartisan is now starting to become more divisive. House Republicans don't really want to see aid for Ukraine passed, it appears. However, with things gridlocked here in the United States, it appears that Europe is beginning to step up. European Union leadership has announced an aid package for Ukraine that amounts to around 60 billion euros. That amounts to roughly 50 billion euros or 54 billion US dollars. And this is aid that will be delivered over the next 4 years. This package aims to provide Ukraine with long-term and predictable funding, which is desperately needed right now, especially with the war in Ukraine appearing to last well into its third year. This aid package also does not keep individual European countries from creating their own aid package. In fact, both France and Germany have announced their own aid packages, with France announcing a package, with France launching a package for Ukraine, which will include up to 40 Scalp cruise missiles, as well as several hundred bombs. Germany has also announced plans for an aid package for Ukraine that will double its aid for Ukraine in 2024. In fact, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz has been calling for other EU leaders to step up aid for Ukraine as well. With the current issues in the US Congress, as well as the upcoming election, aid from the US is probably going to be a little rocky here for the next at least year or so. So it's really important to see that the EU is stepping up and providing aid for Ukraine and filling that void that the US is leaving behind. After all, this does impact their security a little bit more than the United States. Russia's theory of victory right now is to just outlast Ukraine, and the idea is that European and Western leadership will grow wary and the aid for Ukraine will stop eventually. Seeing a long-term 4-year plan from the EU to support Ukraine is really a good sign to see that that's not really what the EU is doing. However, the aid will need to step up. There have been all kinds of reporting from places like Avdiivka where Ukrainian troops are simply running out of ammunition. And simply put, that's unacceptable. That has to be remediated immediately. However, to fix that, you're really looking at defense industrial bases all across Europe and the United States being spun up. And they're going to have to go back to producing ammunition at the rate that they did back in the Cold War, which even then wasn't sufficient. Ukraine has two massive problems right now. One is the issue of ammunition, which we've talked about, and that really there's nothing that Ukraine can necessarily do on their own right now to fix that. It really is reliant on Western support. The other issue that Ukraine faces is with personnel, and that's where the conversation of Ukraine instituting a draft or another round of mobilization come in. But at the same time, that is an internal political challenge that has its own issues across Ukraine. We'll see if that ends up happening anytime soon, but again, these are just challenges that Ukraine is facing going into 2024. Next, I want to talk about Tucker Carlson interviewing Vladimir Putin. And if you haven't heard, Tucker Carlson, yes, is in Moscow to interview Vladimir Putin. In fact, as of the time of this recording, it appears he's already done so. Carlson announced from his Twitter account on the rooftop of the Bolshoi Theater that he would be doing so, and he didn't really frame this interview in a way that makes me feel optimistic, and we'll talk about why here in a moment. But there was a detail here that I didn't realize whenever I first saw this video that was significant. The rooftop of the Bolshoi Theater is closed to the public. You can't really go touring up there. You need official access to get there because it overlooks the rooftop of the Kremlin. Now, I'm in the camp that there can't be too much conversation about an issue. It really is good to see discussion on every side that you possibly can on an issue just to gain understanding. If you're not going to even gain truth from an individual, you can at least know kind of where their headspace is at, especially a decision maker like Putin. However, I also think it's important to acknowledge that there are risks with an interview because not everybody will view an interview like this like through that lens. Most people, meaning people that are not like you or I who pay attention to international affairs and these kinds of things, they might just take whatever is said at face value. They might not look at this interview and what Putin says with any nuance, and they might view Putin as just as credible as any other world leader. Us nerds know that Putin is not a credible source of truth. Journalists, including 2 American journalists, have been killed or jailed in Russia because they attempted to report on the truth. We all know that Russia, and especially Vladimir Putin, is incredibly adept at information operations, the shaping of a narrative, and the changing of people's minds. And this, of course, leads us to the topic of the useful idiot. In information operations, you'll benefit from 2 different kinds of people. First, you have the asset, which is somebody that's directly under your control that you can use to basically generate and spread a narrative. In Russia, those assets can be anything from state media to journalists to different talking heads that generally follow the party line. Second, you have the useful idiot, which is somebody that would be like a grifter or a clout chaser, someone that doesn't necessarily do a lot of due diligence and research, but they might espouse something like free thought. That's not to say that everybody that espouses free thought is a grifter or clout chaser or anything like that, just an example. But in either sense, they're very deeply stuck in their own echo chamber, and this has led them to the point where they can no longer discern between what is true and what is false. Useful idiots can be anywhere. In fact, they exist on any part of the political spectrum, and they certainly have been exploited by Russia on every part of the political spectrum. Now, in today's world, it's perfectly reasonable and justifiable to have doubt and distrust for what the government says. After all, we can all agree that the past few decades have had a few famous issues where the government's credibility can justifiably be called into question. And this has led a lot of people to doubt what the government says and what the mainstream media says. Simultaneously, with multiple global crises going on all across the world, some of which we've talked about in this video, as well as the economy always being a concern, people are really yearning for truth, and they're looking for some sort of reassurance that things are going to be okay. Enter the useful idiot. Now imagine you have a useful idiot who espouses free thought and truth, and who has grown an audience that has not been used to seeing someone say what this individual said in the media, but they espouse that general distrust of the mainstream media and of the government. Now this person might have issues with credibility and honesty, but they're definitely going to stick to what they know. And from potentially your perspective, you might view them as more credible than the mainstream media. Now this is where the useful idiot can become incredibly handy in information operations. As they're fed information that basically reflects their view of the world, they will share that with their audience. Over time, they can be guided away from a place that's necessarily logical or truthful and be brought to an area that fits within the narrative that you're trying to push out there. And thus, the useful idiot has delivered to you their whole audience, which over time has been led away from where they can discern truth from lies. Now, I say all of that to say that I don't have the most confidence that most people will watch this Tucker Carlson interview of Vladimir Putin critically. Instead, because of the narratives that have been spread about both Ukraine and Russia and Putin in the United States and NATO, all the different Russian information campaigns up to this point will create an environment that this audience will watch this interview, and what Putin says will sound truthful. It will reflect what they've heard about NATO. It will reflect what they've heard about Ukraine. And to them, what Putin says will sound truthful. To them, they know that the U.S. government has been dishonest. They know that the U.S. government has not gotten it all right. So then why should they trust what the U.S. government says about Ukraine and not what Vladimir Putin is saying about Ukraine? After all, at least to them, they might not realize that Vladimir Putin has lied to them or that Vladimir Putin is lying to them right now. Now again, for nerds like us that have been watching this whole thing play out for quite a while, it'll be easy to kind of spot these lies because we've been watching the information operation play out for a decade now. However, it might be handy to watch this interview just to see where Putin's headspace is, how he views the world right now, and what he envisions for the future of the war in Ukraine. However, it's not going to be a handy interview to get credible information on why did this war start. I say all this to say, if you're going to watch the interview, watch it cautiously if you choose to do so, and do so critically and seeking the truth. And take this mindset with you, not only whenever you watch an interview with Vladimir Putin, but really anything. And now finally, I have a channel update that I want to talk about here for just a moment, especially for those of you that have been watching this channel for a while. You might have been noticing that I've been changing a lot of things on the channel. I've had a lot of different thumbnail iterations, and I've been kind of experimenting with formatting here for a while. First off, in terms of thumbnails, if there is a thumbnail that I've made that resonated with you more, it would actually help me out a lot if you commented what video resonated with you a lot, and also what video did not resonate, what thumbnail did not resonate with you. But finally, I've been posting YouTube Shorts a lot, and I've been posting those on places like TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. However, on this YouTube channel, that has created a bit of a situation where my long form videos, this video you're watching right now, may not be served to other people who would be interested interested in this video, largely because the audience that I've built on this channel are here for the shorts. And so this will actually be the last long form video that you're going to watch on this channel, at least for a while. I'm going to be moving all of the weekly updates, including this one next week, over to the new channel. And that new channel is going to be Caleb McMurtry. It's going to be just like this. Stay tuned for a community post. I'm going to link everybody to that. But that is where the long form videos are going to go from here on out. And next week's video is going to be posted there. The shorts, however, are going to stay here, and all the long form videos that preceded these weekly updates are also going to stay here. The reason I want to do that is because, again, YouTube's kind of testing out YouTube Shorts. I've been trying out YouTube Shorts. It's creating a bit of a split audience, and unfortunately, these long form videos have not really been able to reach the audience that I'm trying to hit. So if you'll bear with me, this is going to be a bit of a dramatic change. It might be a little traumatic, but I'm going to be posting more in the community tab here. I'm going to be posting on my social media. I'm most active on Twitter, so follow me there if you want some more up-to-date updates on this. But I just want to let you know that that's going to be happening. So thank you all for bearing with me. Definitely share your thoughts on any of these stories that we've talked about. We've talked about, all kinds of different things. There's a lot of controversy in some of these stories. I want to hear your thoughts because there's just too much to go by without hearing your guys' thoughts. So let me know, like this video if you found it helpful or informative, and I will see you all next time, but on the next channel. Later.